So I think we're in a world now where policy rates are probably not going to move particularly sharply. Our view is very gradual cuts towards their neutral level. The exact speed will depend on how the sort of uncertainties about labour markets and growth compare to the uncertainties about inflation. But probably a gentle pace of declines is likely. But in the grand scheme of things, that's probably not going to be too important for the pace of growth that we're seeing, that the impact on economies of that is going to be small. So it's probably going to be other factors that are going to be key drivers of growth for next year.
So can you just flesh out some of those factors? Are we talking geopolitics? Are we talking US trade policy? What are the sort of challenges and opportunities? What are the factors that will be affecting macroeconomics next year?
Well, clearly one of them will be what's going on with trade. I think in contrast to this year, when maybe the uncertainty has been about how high will tariffs in the US rise, it's probably going to be how big are those ripple effects of those higher tariffs. Recently, we've seen pretty strong trade data at a global level, suggesting perhaps the impacts aren't going to be huge. But we've also know that China's doing very well at continuing to export despite that weakness in exports to the US. And certainly one of the concerns is that strength is going to place a bit of a squeeze on some other economies where it's perhaps more directly competing with now. So parts of Europe, other parts of Asia as well in particular, probably most at risk from that China squeeze.
And just following on from that, what is your outlook for China next year? Because we're seeing growth, official rates of growth at the outlook is in the 5% range for next year, but perhaps a bit lower the year after that. What is the outlook here for the Chinese growth, and what effect will that have on the economies in Asia that trade heavily, as well as Australia, with China?
Yeah, well, we're expecting a sort of gradual further slowdown in growth along the lines of what we've been seeing in recent years. I think really that's probably fairly likely, a marginal slowdown. Probably the key uncertainty is the extent to which the Chinese authorities need to deliver stimulus to deliver that. So that's probably the bigger uncertainty than the actual growth rate in many ways. I think the key thing, though, is if what we are seeing with China is it seems like their way of supporting the economy is to expand manufacturing, increase the supply of manufacturing, which once again spills into that issue that may well have some adverse spillovers to the rest of the world. So even if China isn't slowing by very much, the impacts, certainly for some economies of that, might not be great if it's at the expense of further manufacturing expansion.
And by contrast, if we look at the United States, obviously there's continuing talks on the trade front with the US and China, yet to be fully resolved, the hopes that tariffs will be further reduced. But the US seems to be firing on all cylinders. In fact, growth rates have been upgraded by a number of different sources for the US. So do you share that view? Do you have a positive outlook for the US? And what is behind that growth?
Yeah, well, our forecast is certainly at the top of the range of the consensus for the US. We're pretty optimistic about next year. In terms of what's driving that, I think consumer spending has been strong. And to a certain degree, that's being driven by richer households. And probably a key element to that has been the strength of equity markets associated with the big tech. So that's certainly having a positive impact. The other way that AI, I think, is supporting the economy is actually through that surge in investment. In terms of expanding AI capabilities. Once again, there's a lot of uncertainty about how long those positive processes, if you like, will continue and support the US economy. But I think it's probably the case that certainly in the shorter term that those will continue. But obviously, the longer that continues, the bigger the risk that we sort of see perhaps a bit of a fallback at some point in the future. In the way that we know in the past, the dot-com boom and bust, that often these sort of technological breakthroughs can lead to a surge in investment and equity prices that's often followed by a little bit of a bump.
And obviously in the UK as well, I mean, we're here in London, we're talking about a very difficult political situation. Growth is, well, depending on how you look at it, it's obviously much lower than it is in the US. It's on par with some other European countries. But we do have a lot of headwinds. So I wonder, what are the main challenges facing the UK economy going forward, and what is your outlook here?
I think the real challenge for the UK is that it's still got pretty high inflation. So that limits the extent to which monetary policy can be eased, and it will result in a sort of slower return of policy rates to neutral than perhaps in some other economies. For instance, in the Eurozone, they're probably already back at the sort of neutral rate. So that's one element. At the same time, there's limited fiscal wiggle room. Obviously, we've already seen some sort of tax hikes and the like being implemented by the government, albeit some of those aren't going to come through. But the general backdrop for fiscal policy is it's going to be restriction-free for the next 2 or 3 years. And clearly, we've seen policy having to be tightened again and again, and that's sort of affected confidence, whether that's business or consumers. And it's difficult to see a sort of sharp reversal of that. So it will remain quite tricky times, I think, for the UK economy.